One of the most powerful memory systems your brain ever developed may already be weakening, and most people have no idea it's happening. Not because of age, not because of illness, but because millions of people quietly stopped doing one simple action their nervous system spent nearly 20 years training to perform. You learned it as a child with slow, deliberate movements, a pencil in your hand, your eyes tracking every curve, your brain correcting every stroke in real time while an invisible circuit strengthened itself letter by letter. Year after year. Homework, journals, exams, signature, notes in the margins of textbooks. For most of human history, this process was part of daily life. Then keyboards arrived, phones arrived, touch screens replaced paper, and without realizing it, modern life began shutting down a motor cognitive system deeply connected to memory, focus, learning, and fine motor precision. The terrifying part is that typing and handwriting are not neurologically equivalent. Brain imaging studies now show they activate the nervous system in profoundly different ways, especially in the regions responsible for memory encoding and cognitive integration. And once you see what handwriting was actually doing inside your brain all those years, you may start looking at your keyboard less like a convenience and more like a trade. Your hand controls a staggering amount of your brain, far more than most people realize. Across the surface of the motor cortex, different regions are assigned to different body parts. But those regions are not divided according to physical size. They are divided according to complexity. The more precise and demanding the movement, the more neural territory the brain dedicates to controlling it. And human hands require an extraordinary amount of precision, grip adjustment, finger timing, pressure control, directional correction, spatial coordination. In fact, neuroscientists estimate that the hand and fingers occupy nearly a third of the brain's motor command capacity, a disproportionately massive allocation compared to almost every other region of the body. That neural investment evolved over millions of years through tool use, object manipulation, survival tasks, and symbolic communication. Handwriting recruits this system intensely because every letter demands a different motor trajectory, different curves, different angles, different pressures, different corrections. The brain cannot automate handwriting the same way it automates repetitive tapping on a keyboard, and that difference turns out to matter far more than researchers originally believed. Because the moment a pen begins moving across paper, the nervous system starts activating layers of coordination most digital input never fully requires. The difference between handwriting and typing is far more extreme than most people imagine. Your brain does not interpret them as two versions of the same activity. Neurologically, they are almost different worlds. When you handwrite a single word like science, your nervous system must generate a unique motor plan for every individual letter. Curves shift, angles change, pressure adjusts constantly, while your eyes monitor the ink in real time. Tiny corrections happen almost instantly, often without conscious awareness. The movement is alive. Typing that same word is radically simpler. Every key press is nearly identical. Same downward motion. Same mechanical travel. Same repetitive action repeated again and again until the brain begins treating the movement like automated machinery instead of active construction. And this is where memory begins separating itself from convenience. Researchers discovered that the complexity of movement directly affects the depth of neural activation. More complex movement recruits broader cortical engagement, stronger sensory integration, and more intense memory encoding. In other words, your brain remembers information differently depending on how your body physically creates it. The keyboard captures language efficiently, but the pen forces the nervous system to build language through movement, correction, and spatial coordination. What looks slower on the surface is actually forcing the brain into participation because every stroke demands attention, prediction, feedback, and adjustment at the exact moment the information is being formed and encoded into memory. What makes handwriting so neurologically powerful is not the pen itself. It is the loop the pen forces your brain to enter. Neuroscientists describe handwriting as a closed-loop motor activity, meaning the brain must continuously monitor and adjust the movement while it is happening. The moment the pen touches paper, multiple systems activate simultaneously. Your visual cortex tracks the ink trail in real time. Motor planning regions predict the next movement before it happens. Spatial processing centers calculate angles, direction, and placement across the page. Error correction systems compare intended movement against actual movement, while the hand constantly makes microscopic adjustments to pressure and trajectory. 5 major neural systems coordinating together for every single word. Typing bypasses much of this process. Experienced typists rarely look at their fingers because the movement has become open loop and automatic. The hands execute repetitive commands with minimal visual correction, which dramatically reduces the level of sensory integration required from the brain. That difference matters because the nervous system responds to demand. The more coordination required, the more widespread the cortical activation becomes, and this may explain why handwriting often feels mentally slower but cognitively deeper. Your brain is not simply recording information, it is negotiating with it through movement, vision, prediction, and correction all at once. The unsettling implication is that millions of people may have unknowingly replaced one of the brain's richest daily activation systems with a far narrower form of input, and the electrical consequences of that shift became visible the moment scientists finally measured the brain during writing itself. The moment researchers placed high-density EEG scanners on people while they wrote by hand, the conversation around memory changed completely. Because for the first time, scientists could actually watch the brain respond differently to handwriting and typing in real time, and the difference was not subtle. Handwriting produced significantly stronger theta wave activity across regions associated with learning, memory encoding, and cognitive integration. Theta oscillations are deeply connected to the transfer of information from short-term processing into long-term storage. Higher theta activity predicts stronger recall later. Typing produced far weaker activation patterns by comparison. Even when the information being typed was identical, same words, same language, same ideas, completely different neural response. Researchers at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology concluded that handwriting recruits the brain's encoding systems more intensely because the movement itself is more demanding, more spatially complex, and more sensorily integrated. In other words, your memory is not shaped only by what you learn. It is shaped by how your nervous system physically experiences the learning process while information is entering the brain. And once that became measurable, another unsettling pattern started appearing in classrooms, lecture halls, and workplaces across the country. Because the people recording the most information were not always the people understanding it best. Students who typed the fastest often leave lectures believing they learned more. Because their screens contain more information, more sentences, more quotes, more perfectly transcribed explanations. But study after study has revealed the same disturbing pattern. The people recording the highest volume of information are frequently retaining less of its meaning. Researchers at Princeton and UCLA discovered that students taking handwritten notes consistently performed better on conceptual questions than students typing notes on laptops. Even though the typists captured dramatically more content, the reason has almost nothing to do with intelligence or effort. It has to do with speed. Typing is fast enough to keep pace with spoken language, which allows the brain to slip into passive capture mode. The fingers continue recording information even while comprehension weakens. Handwriting interrupts that automation. Because the hand cannot physically move fast enough to capture every sentence, the brain is forced to make decisions in real time. What matters, what should be shortened, what idea connects to the previous one. The slowness becomes a filtering system for understanding. Instead of transcribing information, the writer begins restructuring it, compressing it, translating it into personally meaningful language before the memory trace is even formed. You have probably experienced this without realizing it. Typed notes often look impressive on the screen, yet feel strangely difficult to remember later. Handwritten notes usually contain less, but the information feels anchored somewhere deeper, and that raises an uncomfortable possibility. Because if modern technology optimized learning for speed instead of cognitive depth, then millions of people may have mistaken efficient recording for genuine understanding their entire lives. As researchers continued investigating the relationship between movement and cognition, Another pattern started emerging beyond classrooms and lecture halls. The loss was not limited to memory or studying. The same neural systems strengthened through handwriting also appeared deeply connected to aging, motor precision, and the long-term maintenance of the brain's delicate coordination circuits. The modern world is obsessed with speed because speed feels productive. Faster communication, faster typing, faster information, faster responses. But the human brain did not evolve for constant cognitive acceleration, and handwriting may expose a hidden weakness in the way modern people now process information every day. Thought moves faster than either typing or writing. Yet, typing comes dangerously close to matching the surface speed of internal language. The fingers can capture words almost as quickly as they appear in consciousness, which means the brain no longer needs to slow down and evaluate what deserves attention. Handwriting changes that relationship immediately. The hand moves too slowly to preserve every thought intact, forcing the nervous system to compress, prioritize, and organize information while it is still forming. The friction becomes part of the intelligence itself. Remove the friction, and the brain gradually shifts from active construction into passive collection. That may explain why endless digital information often produces the strange sensation of consuming more while remembering less. The nervous system was designed to strengthen through resistance, not convenience. And once researchers started viewing handwriting as a form of daily neural resistance training instead of old-fashioned communication, an even darker implication began appearing, especially in adults over 45. The most unsettling part of this entire story is that the consequences of abandoning handwriting usually do not appear immediately. The circuit fades slowly, quietly, often over decades. Until people begin noticing subtle changes, they rarely connect back to the disappearance of the pen. A signature becomes shakier than it used to be. Buttons take longer to fasten. Coins feel harder to manipulate. Hand movements lose precision. The nervous system starts struggling with tasks that once felt automatic, especially after middle age. When fine motor decline naturally accelerates, neuroscientists have long known that the brain weakens circuits it no longer uses consistently. This principle, called use-dependent plasticity, affects nearly every neural pathway in the body. Connections receiving regular stimulation remain strong and efficient. Connections deprived of stimulation begin degrading over time. Handwriting once acted as daily maintenance for some of the most complex coordination systems the human brain possesses. Every sentence recruited visual tracking, pressure control, finger sequencing, spatial planning, and continuous error correction simultaneously. Remove that daily demand for 10 or 20 years, and the nervous system begins adapting to the absence of complexity. The frightening part is that many people mistake this gradual weakening for normal aging, when it may partly reflect lost neural stimulation. Neurologists even monitor changes in handwriting quality as an early signal of cognitive and motor decline, because handwriting depends on multiple fragile systems functioning together at once. When coordination weakens, the signature often changes before people notice anything else. And modern adults may be the first generation in history to remove this training stimulus voluntarily for most of their lives. For decades, the brain expected a daily workout it no longer receives. That absence may help explain why so many people experience increasing cognitive fatigue despite living in the most technologically assisted era humanity has ever created. The disturbing reality is that convenience does not always preserve function. Sometimes it quietly replaces it. And once researchers began examining what this shift might mean for aging brains specifically, the conversation around handwriting stopped sounding nostalgic and started sounding strangely preventative. After the age of 45, the nervous system begins changing in ways most people never consciously notice at first. Motor neurons fire less efficiently. Precision movements become slightly slower. Sensory feedback weakens subtly year after year, while the brain gradually loses some of the flexibility it once used to maintain complex coordination. None of this happens overnight. That is what makes it dangerous. The decline feels invisible until ordinary tasks begin requiring more concentration than they used to. Handwriting becomes especially important during this stage because it forces the brain to rehearse fine motor precision repeatedly under real-time sensory supervision. Every handwritten sentence becomes a small neurological workout involving pressure calibration, directional control, visual tracking, and continuous correction. 5 minutes of handwriting may activate more coordinated fine motor processing than hours of passive screen interaction. Researchers studying aging and neuroplasticity increasingly believe that consistent low-level stimulation matters more than occasional intense effort. The brain strengthens what it repeatedly uses. It conserves energy by weakening what disappears from daily life. That principle applies to memory, coordination, focus, and even emotional processing, which means the disappearance of handwriting may not simply represent a cultural shift. It may represent the quiet removal of one of the brain's oldest maintenance rituals. And if that possibility sounds concerning for adults already experiencing cognitive fatigue, the implications become even more unsettling when the same transition begins happening during childhood itself. For the first time in human history, an entire generation is growing up, learning language primarily through glass, dots, and predictive text instead of complex handwritten movement. And neuroscientists are becoming increasingly concerned that something foundational may be changing underneath that transition. Studies comparing children who learn letters through handwriting versus typing consistently show the same pattern. Children writing by hand develop stronger letter recognition, better reading performance, and more robust activation in brain regions associated with learning and language integration. The reason appears deeply connected to movement. When a child slowly forms a letter by hand, the brain does not store only a visual symbol. It stores a motor experience tied to shape, direction, pressure, and spatial trajectory. Later, when the child sees that letter again, the nervous system partially reactivates the motor memory associated with creating it. The brain remembers not just what the letter looked like, but what it physically felt like to build it. Typing weakens much of that richness because every key press becomes mechanically similar. The letter A and the letter S are no longer unique movements. They are almost identical downward taps separated only by location on a keyboard. Some researchers now fear that children raised primarily through touchscreens may develop language systems built on shallower sensory integration than previous generations. The symbols remain visible, but the underlying motor architecture becomes weaker, and the implications may extend far beyond handwriting itself into attention span, memory formation, reading fluency, and long-term cognitive resilience. What appears technologically advanced on the surface may quietly remove one of the deepest forms of multisensory brain training childhood once provided automatically. And the deeper researchers investigate this disappearing circuit, the stranger the story becomes. Because even within handwriting itself, certain forms of writing appear to activate the nervous system more intensely than others. Cursive writing activates the brain differently, even compared to standard print. Because the nervous system must maintain continuous movement across entire words without repeatedly resetting the hand between letters, the pen remains in motion while the brain plans upcoming strokes before the current ones are fully completed, creating a longer horizon of coordination, prediction, and spatial control. That uninterrupted flow appears to deepen the engagement between motor planning and sensory feedback systems, which may explain why many neuroscientists view cursive as a powerful form of neuroplasticity training rather than outdated penmanship. The effect becomes even more dramatic when people attempt writing with their non-dominant hand. Suddenly the movement feels awkward, unstable, almost childlike again. But that awkwardness is not failure. It is the nervous system encountering novelty and rebuilding coordination in real time. The opposite hemisphere of the brain becomes heavily recruited while unfamiliar motor pathways activate under intense conscious attention. Even 30 seconds of non-dominant handwriting can produce unusually broad neural engagement because the brain cannot rely on automated movement patterns anymore. Every curve must be monitored deliberately. Every correction becomes effortful. And this reveals something profound about cognition itself. The brain grows strongest not during perfect efficiency, but during controlled difficulty. The moment movement becomes challenging again, deeper adaptation begins. And strangely enough, one of the most powerful memory advantages of handwriting may have nothing to do with language at all. Your brain does not remember information as isolated sentences floating in space. It remembers environments, location, patterns, and physical relationships. Handwriting naturally creates those relationships because every note exists somewhere tangible on a page. A phrase sits near a diagram. An important idea appears in the upper corner. An arrow connects two concepts physically across space. Over time, the brain begins attaching information to location itself, creating what neuroscientists call spatial encoding. That is why handwritten notes often produce strange moments of recall where people remember not only the idea, but exactly where it appeared on the paper. Memory becomes partly geographical. Typed information weakens much of this effect because digital text tends to exist inside uniform visual structures. Same font, same spacing, same scrolling patterns. The page loses physical uniqueness, and the brain loses additional retrieval cues connected to spatial variation. Handwritten diagrams, sketches, circles, and margin notes deepen the effect even further because the nervous system starts storing meaning through movement and layout simultaneously. The brain is not simply reading information anymore. It is navigating it physically, and eventually handwriting begins touching something even deeper than memory itself. Because every handwritten page quietly carries traces of the human nervous system that created it, every handwritten page contains something no keyboard has ever been able to replicate: a physical signature of the nervous system behind it. Pressure, rhythm, spacing, slant, speed, tiny hesitations between letters. The human brain processes these patterns almost instantly, often before consciously reading the words themselves. That is why people can recognize the handwriting of a parent, spouse, or grandparent within seconds. The page carries traces of movement unique to the person who created it, almost like a neurological fingerprint transferred into ink. A handwritten letter does not simply deliver language. It delivers presence. Researchers studying perception and motor simulation believe the brain partially recreates the act of writing while observing handwritten text, activating low-level motor systems connected to the movement being viewed. In other words, reading, handwriting may allow one nervous system to subtly simulate another. Digital text removes nearly all of that biological individuality. Every email looks mechanically identical, regardless of who typed it. The emotional texture disappears beneath uniform fonts and perfectly repeated characters. That may explain why handwritten notes often feel strangely permanent compared to digital messages. Even when the words themselves are simple, a folded letter inside a drawer can carry emotional weight for decades because the page preserves more than information. It preserves evidence of effort, movement, and physical time invested by another human being. And modern life may be underestimating how psychologically important that distinction actually is. The nervous system evolved around embodied communication, not frictionless transmission, which is why handwriting affects not only memory and learning, but also emotional processing itself. Once movement slows down enough for thoughts to pass through the body instead of directly into a screen, something unexpected begins happening to the way people process stress, reflection, and internal experience. People often describe handwritten journaling as calming without fully understanding why. But the effect may come from the same neurological mechanisms that make handwriting so powerful for memory in the first place. Thoughts move rapidly through the mind, especially during stress, anxiety, or emotional overload. Typing allows those thoughts to spill outward almost at full speed. Often without forcing the brain to organize them deeply, handwriting interrupts that acceleration immediately. The hand moves slowly enough that the nervous system must compress emotional experience into manageable language while the thought is still unfolding. The slowness becomes emotional processing. Researchers studying expressive writing found that people who regularly write by hand about stressful experiences often show measurable improvements in mood, stress regulation, and even aspects of physical health over time. The brain appears to benefit from transforming internal chaos into structured movement and language simultaneously. That may explain why handwritten journals often feel more intimate, reflective, and psychologically grounding than digital entries. The page forces the mind to stay present long enough to actually experience its own thoughts instead of merely exporting them. And eventually this entire pattern points toward a much larger modern trade-off most people never realized they were making. The pen was never replaced because it stopped working. It was replaced because keyboards became faster, easier, cleaner, and infinitely more efficient for moving information through modern life. And in many ways, that efficiency transformed civilization. Communication accelerated, productivity increased. Entire industries became digitally interconnected almost overnight. But efficiency often hides a biological trade-off. Especially when technology removes forms of friction, the human nervous system evolved, expecting to encounter every day. Walking offers a useful comparison. Human beings walked constantly for thousands of years because movement was built directly into survival. Cars eliminated much of that daily physical demand. And only decades later did people fully understand the health consequences of removing it. Handwriting may represent a cognitive version of the same transition. The brain once received complex motor, Spatial, and sensory stimulation through writing every single day almost automatically. Modern technology removed much of that stimulation with remarkable speed, especially during childhood and early adulthood. Before neuroscience fully understood what the nervous system was actually gaining from the activity itself. The keyboard improved information transfer while quietly reducing embodied cognitive engagement, and because the transition happened gradually across generations, most people never recognized the shift while it was occurring. The strange exhaustion many people now feel after consuming endless streams of digital information may partly reflect this imbalance. More information entering the brain, less physical participation in constructing it. The modern world optimized cognitive convenience, but the nervous system still appears deeply dependent on challenge, resistance, and movement, which means the solution may not require abandoning technology at all. It may simply require reintroducing a stimulus. The brain was never designed to lose completely. The encouraging part is that this circuit does not appear permanently lost. Even after years of relying almost entirely on keyboards and touchscreens, the nervous system still responds surprisingly quickly once handwriting returns. Researchers studying neuroplasticity found that the first few minutes of handwriting often produce the strongest increase in coordinated brain activation, particularly in systems connected to attention, motor indication, and memory encoding. The brain remembers the circuit even after long periods of silence. That is why 5 minutes of daily handwriting may matter far more than people expect. Not perfect handwriting, not beautiful handwriting, simply consistent movement through real physical space. A grocery list written on paper, a short journal entry beside the bed, notes during a meeting instead of typing everything mechanically into a laptop. The content matters less than the neurological participation required to create it. The pen forces the nervous system back into coordination, and once that happens, the entire story surrounding handwriting begins changing from nostalgia into something far more biologically serious. What began as a simple comparison between handwriting and typing turns out to reveal something much deeper about the human brain itself. Handwriting was never just a method of communication. It was a daily form of cognitive training woven quietly into human life for generations. Activating memory encoding, spatial awareness, motor precision, emotional processing, and long-term neural maintenance all at once. Modern technology increased convenience dramatically. But convenience does not always preserve biological function. Sometimes the brain still needs resistance, movement, and physical engagement to remain fully active. The encouraging news is that these systems are still remarkably adaptable. Your brain is not waiting for perfection. It is waiting for stimulation. Even a few minutes of handwriting each day may help strengthen focus, reinforce memory retention, support fine motor coordination, and reconnect the nervous system to forms of cognitive engagement modern life increasingly removes. Try writing a short journal entry tonight. Write tomorrow's grocery list by hand. Take notes on paper during your next meeting and pay attention to how differently the information feels afterward. Small habits repeated consistently often create the biggest neurological changes over time. If you found this video valuable, save it so you can revisit these ideas later. And subscribe for more evidence-based videos exploring brain health, memory, neuroscience, aging, and the hidden biology shaping everyday life. Because your nervous system may be far more trainable than you were ever taught to believe. And perhaps the better question is no longer whether handwriting matters, but what other ancient brain systems modern life has quietly convinced us to stop using.